June 13, 1944. Villers-Bocage, Normandy. Hauptmann Klaus Becker stood in the turret of his Panther Ausf A, scanning the hedgerow country through Zeiss optics that cost more than a French farmhouse. His tank represented the apex of German engineering, 56 tons of sloped armour and precision machinery. The 75mm Cable 42 litres, 70 gun could punch through any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. The frontal glacis plate, 80mm thick and angled at 55 degrees, was mathematically impervious to every anti-tank weapon the Americans possessed. Becker had read the intelligence assessments. He had studied the technical specifications. He knew exactly what threats his Panther could withstand. The American 75mm Sherman gun could not penetrate his frontal armour at any combat range. The British 17-pounder needed a near-perpendicular hit to threaten him. Soviet 85mm guns required luck and favourable angles. His Panther cost the Reich 117,000 Reichsmarks, 6 months to manufacture, 18,000 hours of skilled labour. Krupp steel plate machined to tolerances measured in tenths of millimetres. A Maybach HL 230p30 engine delivering 700 horsepower. A transmission so complex it required 3 weeks of specialised training just to maintain properly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Everything about the Panther spoke of German technical superiority. Becker believed this absolutely. Every panzer commander believed it. They had to believe it because the mathematics of the war had turned decisively against Germany, and superior engineering was all they had left. But that morning, tucked into hedgerows 400 metres ahead, American infantry were digging in with weapons that German procurement officers had dismissed as barely adequate support equipment. Weapons so cheap and simple that Detroit assembly line workers stamped them out during lunch breaks. Weapons that intelligence analysts had categorized as tactical nuisances rather than strategic threats. By 1600 hours, 14 Panthers from Panzerlehr Division would be burning wrecks, and Klaus Becker would understand that everything German doctrine assumed about armour warfare had just been invalidated by a tube of steel, 2 batteries, and a shaped charge that cost $33 American. The story of how American industrial philosophy destroyed German technical perfection begins not in Normandy, not in Detroit, but in a Swiss patent office in 1938, where a concept that military establishments across Europe had dismissed as impractical was about to change infantry combat forever. Henry Haupt was not a soldier. He was a Swiss chemical engineer working for Schweizerische Industriegesellschaft, a small industrial firm in Neuhausen. His area of expertise was shaped explosive charges for mining and demolition work. The physics were well understood. Concentrate, explosive force using a cone-shaped metal liner. Upon detonation, the liner converts into a hypersonic jet of molten metal capable of burning through steel, concrete, or rock. Mining companies used shaped charges to blast through difficult rock formations. Demolition crews used them to cut steel beams. The principle was simple physics, discovered by accident in the late 19th century and refined through decades of commercial application. But in 1938, as Europe prepared for war, Haupt realized something that professional military engineers had somehow missed. If a shaped charge could burn through rock and steel in mining operations, it could burn through tank armor. The challenge was making it work as a weapon. Existing anti-tank guns relied on kinetic energy. Fire a solid projectile at extremely high velocity. The kinetic energy punches through armor, but this required massive guns with long barrels and heavy mounts. These weapons could not accompany infantry into assault. Shaped charges offered a different approach. The penetration came from the explosive itself, not from velocity. A shaped charge, moving at 300 meters per second, could penetrate as effectively as a kinetic projectile moving at 900 meters per second. This meant infantry could carry shaped charges without needing heavy guns or high-velocity weapons. Haupt developed prototypes and approached Swiss military officials. They were politely uninterested. Switzerland was neutral. They had no need for infantry anti-tank weapons. He approached French military attachés. They expressed mild interest, but took no action. France was confident in the Maginot Line and conventional anti-tank guns. He approached British officials. Same response. Interesting concept, not a priority. Existing anti-tank rifles and guns were considered adequate. Then, in 1940, France fell in 6 weeks. The British evacuated Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all their heavy equipment. German panzers had demonstrated that existing anti-tank defences were catastrophically inadequate. Haupt fled to the United States. He brought his patents, his technical documentation, and his prototypes. In August 1940, he demonstrated his shaped charge technology to American Army Ordnance officials at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The Americans had been searching for exactly this kind of weapon. The U.S. Army had observed the fall of France with professional horror. American military intelligence assessed that German armor tactics would require American infantry to possess effective, portable anti-tank capability. The standard American anti-tank rifle, the Boys, .55 caliber, was already obsolete. It could not penetrate German medium tank armor. Captain Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, both Army Ordnance officers, had been experimenting with infantry rocket launchers since early 1942. They had developed a simple tube that could launch small rockets using electrical ignition. The problem was the warhead. Existing high-explosive rounds lacked penetration against armor. Haupt's shaped charge technology solved their problem. Combine a shaped charge warhead with a simple rocket launcher, and you created a weapon that infantry could carry and fire without specialized training. The concept was approved for development in May 1942. Development proceeded with remarkable speed. By June 1942, prototypes were being tested. By November 1942, the weapon was standardized as the Launcher, Rocket, Anti-Tank, M1. Soldiers immediately nicknamed it the Bazooka, after a musical instrument used by comedian Bob Burns. The final design was almost insulting in its simplicity. A seamless steel tube, 54 inches long, diameter, 2.36 inches. Total weight, 13.25 pounds. Electrical firing mechanism powered by 2 standard flashlight batteries. Wire sights with range graduations to 300 yards. Shoulder stock. That was everything. The rocket was equally simple. M6A1 high-explosive anti-tank round. Weight, 3.4 pounds. Shaped charge warhead with copper cone liner, solid fuel rocket motor, stabilizing fins, contact detonator. Production cost per rocket, $33 in 1943. American industry began mass production immediately. General Electric received the initial contract for launchers. Smaller contractors across the Midwest produced rockets. By December 1942, the first bazookas were being shipped to North Africa for combat testing. German intelligence first encountered the bazooka in Tunisia during Rommel's counteroffensive in February 1943. Captured weapons were sent to Berlin for analysis. The technical assessment was damning in its condescension. The Waffenamt report from March 1943 described the bazooka as a primitive but functional infantry support weapon of limited effectiveness. German engineers noted the simple construction, the crude sighting system, the modest penetration capability. Maximum armor penetration was estimated at 80 to 90 millimeters under optimal conditions. This assessment was technically accurate. The bazooka could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of German medium tanks, but the assessment missed what mattered. The Americans were not trying to create the perfect anti-tank weapon. They were creating a weapon that was good enough, cheap enough, and simple enough to give to every infantry squad. German anti-tank doctrine remained focused on specialized weapons operated by trained crews. The PaK 40 75mm anti-tank gun was an excellent weapon. It could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. But it weighed over 1,000 kilograms and required a crew of 6, plus a prime mover vehicle. The Panzerschreck, Germany's copy of the American bazooka, was technically superior. 88mm diameter, greater penetration capability, heavier warhead, but it weighed 11 kilograms compared to the Bazooka's 6 kilograms. Production was more complex. Distribution was limited to specialized anti-tank sections rather than general infantry squads. By mid-1944, American infantry divisions were equipped with approximately 500 to 600 bazookas distributed down to squad level. Every rifle company had multiple bazooka teams. Every platoon had at least one bazooka operator trained to standard proficiency. German divisions had fewer Panzerschrecks, distributed at company level rather than squad level. The numerical disparity was overwhelming. For every German soldier carrying a Panzerschreck, 3 or 4 American soldiers carried bazookas. But numbers alone did not explain what would happen at Villers-Bocage. The critical factor was doctrine. American infantry were trained to fight as combined arms teams. Riflemen suppressed enemy positions. Machine gunners provided covering fire. Bazooka teams maneuvered to firing positions and engaged armor at close range. German panzer crews were trained to avoid close combat with infantry. Doctrine emphasized maintaining standoff range, where superior optics and guns provided advantage. Panthers were designed to destroy enemy tanks at 2,000 meters, while remaining invulnerable to return fire. This doctrine assumed enemy infantry lacked effective anti-tank weapons. That assumption was about to kill 14 Panther crews in one afternoon. Klaus Becker commanded the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion, Panzerlehr Regiment 130. His company consisted of 14 Panther Ausf A tanks plus his command tank. These were not early production Panthers with mechanical problems. These were late production models with improved transmissions and final drives. His crews were veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, men who had learned their trade fighting Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second. Panzerlehr Division was an elite formation. The name meant Demonstration Division. It had been created in 1943 as a training division to demonstrate proper panzer tactics. Only experienced officers and NCOs were assigned. Every enlisted man had completed at least one combat tour. This was the absolute best Germany could field. On June 13th, Panzerlehr was ordered to counterattack British forces advancing from the Normandy beachhead. The specific objective was Villers-Bocage, a small town where British tanks had penetrated German lines. Becker's company would advance along the road from Caen, engage British armour, and restore the defensive line. Intelligence reported British Sherman tanks and Cromwell tanks in the area. Becker's Panthers outmatched both types, decisively. Sherman armour was inadequate against the Panther's 75mm gun. Cromwell armour was even thinner. At normal combat ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 meters, the Panthers should achieve complete dominance. The advance began at 0700 hours. Becker's company moved in standard tactical formation. Lead tanks forward, main body following at intervals, rear security watching flanks. The hedgerow terrain was problematic. Visibility was limited to 200 meters in many locations. The narrow roads forced the Panthers to advance in column rather than line abreast, but this was familiar terrain, similar to rural Germany. The crews had trained for this. Becker felt confident. His Panthers had faced worse in Russia. Soviet anti-tank guns and T-34 seconds were more dangerous than anything the British possessed. At 09:30 hours, the lead Panther reported contact. British infantry positions ahead. No tanks visible. Becker ordered the company to deploy for assault. Standard procedure. Suppress infantry positions with machine gun and high explosive fire, then advance through the position. The lead Panther fired several high explosive shells into the hedgerows, where British infantry were dug in. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition stores were hit. The crew reported infantry retreating. Becker ordered advance to continue. That was when the first bazooka round hit. The rocket came from a hedgerow 80 meters to the right. The shaped charge jet punched through the side armour of the lead Panther just behind the turret ring, 35 millimeters of vertical steel plate, well within the bazooka's penetration envelope. The jet penetrated into the crew compartment, igniting ammunition stored in racks along the hull. The Panther's ammunition load consisted of 79 rounds of 75mm shells. Each round contained high explosive propellant. When the shaped charge jet ignited this ammunition, the result was catastrophic. The Panther's turret blew completely off the hull, tumbling through the air before crashing into a hedgerow 30 meters away. 4 of the 5 crew members died instantly. The driver, positioned in the forward hull away from the ammunition explosion, survived with severe burns. He crawled from the wreckage, screaming. British infantry shot him before he reached cover. Becker watched this happen through his commander's optics. He did not immediately understand what he had witnessed. The explosion pattern was wrong for a tank round. Too much fire, too violent. Not a mine because the Panther had not been moving when it was hit. Then he saw the smoke trail, a distinctive straight line from the hedgerow to the burning Panther. Rocket exhaust signature. But British infantry did not have rockets. Intelligence had never mentioned British rockets. His radio operator was already calling for information. What hit Bowden? What weapon? The other Panther commanders were demanding instructions. Do we advance? Do we pull back? Where is the threat? Becker did not have answers. He knew only that something in those hedgerows had just destroyed a 56-ton tank with one shot from less than 100 meters. He ordered the company to halt and take up defensive positions. The Panthers formed a loose circle, turrets facing outward, covering all approaches. This was Eastern Front doctrine. When ambushed, consolidate, identify the threat, then respond with overwhelming firepower. But hedgerow country was not the Eastern Front. On the steppe, you could see for kilometers. Threats were visible at range. Here, visibility was measured in tens of meters. The Panthers could not see what was hunting them. Another rocket streaked from a different hedgerow. This one missed, passing just over the turret of Becker's command Panther. The rocket motor burned for 3 seconds before the projectile impacted a stone wall 200 meters beyond and detonated, harmlessly. But now Becker knew 2 things. First, the enemy had multiple rocket launchers. Second, they were positioned in a semicircle around his company. This was a prepared ambush. The British had not retreated. They had pulled back into prepared firing positions and waited for the Panthers to enter the kill zone. A third rocket hit the trailing Panther in Becker's formation. This crew had their hatches open. Standard procedure when not in direct combat to improve visibility and ventilation. The shaped charge penetrated the thin top armor above the engine compartment. The Maybach engine's fuel lines ruptured. High-octane gasoline sprayed across the superheated engine block. The Panther became a rolling fireball. The crew attempted to bail out. The commander and gunner escaped through the turret hatches. Both were on fire. They rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish flames while British machine gun fire cut them down. The loader died inside the tank. The driver and radio operator abandoned the vehicle through the forward hull hatches and reached cover. They were the only survivors from that crew. Becker now had 2 Panthers destroyed and 2 more damaged from the same unit. Casualties were mounting. He had not seen a single British tank. He had not engaged a single legitimate armour target. His elite panzer company was being destroyed by infantry. He radioed battalion headquarters requesting immediate artillery support and infantry to clear the hedgerows. The response was not encouraging. Artillery was committed to supporting other units. Infantry were pinned down by British counterfire. Becker's company was on its own. This was the moment when German armour doctrine collapsed. Panthers were designed to fight other tanks at long range. They were not designed for close-quarters infantry combat. Their mobility advantage was negated by terrain. Their armour advantage meant nothing when infantry could fire from concealment at ranges under 100 meters. Becker made the decision that would save most of his company, but abandon the mission. He ordered withdrawal. The Panthers would reverse course, return to their start positions, and await support before attempting another advance. Executing this withdrawal in hedgerow terrain under fire was nearly impossible. The Panthers had to reverse down narrow roads with limited visibility. They could not turn around. The British infantry with their rocket launchers were on both flanks and potentially behind them. As the company began withdrawing, 2 more Panthers were hit. One took a rocket to the rear deck armor. The engine was destroyed, but the crew escaped. The second was hit in the turret side. The penetration killed the gunner and loader. The commander ordered the survivors to abandon the tank. The withdrawal took 40 minutes to complete. 40 minutes of creeping backward down dirt roads, while British rockets streaked from hedgerows and British machine guns raked any exposed crew members. When Becker's company finally reached friendly lines, he counted survivors. 9 Panthers had been destroyed or abandoned. 5 Panthers had reached safety, but 3 of those had damage requiring workshop repairs. His company was effectively destroyed. Casualty count: 27 dead, 15 wounded, 8 missing. And he had not fired a shot at British armour. He had not accomplished any part of his mission. The after-action report that Becker submitted that evening reads like a confession of failure. He described the ambush, the rocket weapons, the inability to identify firing positions, the decision to withdraw. He recommended that Panthers should not be committed to operations in close terrain without extensive infantry support and artillery preparation. Division headquarters' response was bureaucratic and unhelpful. Panthers were needed for counterattacks. Infantry support was limited. Artillery was already overcommitted. Panzer commanders were expected to adapt their tactics to achieve success. But there was no tactic that could adapt away the fundamental problem. German doctrine assumed armor superiority at all ranges. The American bazooka had created a range band where infantry held the advantage. Under 200 meters in complex terrain, a 13-pound weapon wielded by a 2-man team could destroy a 56-ton tank, costing 117,000 Reichsmarks. The mathematics were devastating. Becker's company represented an investment of approximately 1.6 million Reichsmarks in vehicles alone. Training costs for his crews added perhaps another 500,000 Reichsmarks. Total: over 2 million Reichsmarks destroyed in one afternoon. The American infantry battalion that ambushed him carried perhaps 40 bazookas. Total cost: approximately $1,600 for the launchers, plus $33 per rocket. If they fired 100 rockets during the engagement, total ammunition cost was $3,300. Combined cost: $5,000 in American equipment destroyed 2 million Reichsmarks in German equipment. The exchange ratio was 400 to 1. For every dollar America invested in bazookas and rockets, Germany lost 400 Reichsmarks in destroyed tanks. This was industrial warfare reduced to pure mathematics. Germany could not win this equation. But the true cost was not measured in Reichsmarks. The true cost was psychological. Klaus Becker had been a panzer commander for 3 years. He had fought in France, in Russia, across the Eastern Front. He had destroyed Soviet tanks, British tanks, and American tanks. He believed in German technical superiority because every combat experience had confirmed it. In one afternoon, that belief died. The weapon that killed it was so simple, so cheap, so unsophisticated that German intelligence had dismissed it as barely worthy of attention. A steel tube, 2 batteries, a shaped charge, fired by infantry who might have 6 weeks of training. That night, Becker sat in his command vehicle and wrote letters to the families of his dead crew members, 27 letters. He had written such letters before, but this time felt different. Before, his men had died fighting other tanks. They had died in combat against worthy opponents. They had died because the enemy was skilled or lucky, or because war is random and brutal. This time, they had died because German doctrine was obsolete, because intelligence had failed to recognize a game-changing weapon, because the entire structure of German armor warfare was built on assumptions that were no longer true. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pattern that destroyed Becker's company at Villers-Bocage repeated across Normandy throughout June and July 1944. American and British infantry were equipped with bazookas and piatis, the British equivalent. German Panthers and Tigers, technically superior to any Allied tank, were ambushed and destroyed by infantry at close range. The Panzer Division, that elite demonstration unit, was reduced to 30% effectiveness within 2 weeks of entering combat, not primarily through tank versus tank engagements. Through infantry anti-tank weapons, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich lost 40% of its armour in Normandy. Again, not to Allied tanks but to infantry armed with bazookas, PIATs, and later to fighter bombers once Allied air supremacy was established. American industrial production created the numerical advantage. By mid-1944, the United States was producing approximately 1,500 tanks per month. Germany was producing approximately 600 tanks and assault guns per month, 2.5 to 1 American advantage in tank production, but bazooka production was even more lopsided. The United States produced over 476,000 bazookas during the war. Germany produced approximately 289,000 Panzerschrecks. American production advantage, 1.6 to 1. More critically, American bazookas entered service in 1942. German Panzerschrecks began production in late 1943, more than a year later. For that entire year, American infantry possessed effective anti-tank weapons while German infantry did not. The impact on German armoured operations was cumulative and devastating. Panzer commanders became cautious. They avoided close terrain. They waited for infantry support before advancing. They operated conservatively because aggressive tactics resulted in destroyed tanks. This caution contradicted the entire philosophy of blitzkrieg warfare: speed, aggression, breakthrough, exploitation. These principles required armour to operate independently, to take risks, to exploit opportunities, without waiting for support. But by mid-1944, independent panzer operations were suicide. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 demonstrated this completely. German forces attempting to escape encirclement had to move through narrow roads flanked by hedgerows and forests, perfect terrain for infantry ambush. American bazookas destroyed hundreds of German vehicles, not just tanks but half-tracks, trucks, armoured cars, anything that moved. Survivors from Panzer Lehr described the pocket as a slaughterhouse, not because of Allied tanks or artillery, though both were present, because every bend in the road, every tree line, every farm building concealed American infantry with bazookas. German columns would advance until the lead vehicle was destroyed. Then the column would stop, trapped between burning vehicles and pursuing forces. Bazooka teams would work methodically down the column, hit the second vehicle, wait for crews to abandon their machines, hit the third vehicle. The Germans could not maneuver. They could not return effective fire against infantry in covered positions. They could only abandon their vehicles and attempt to escape on foot. Post-war analysis estimated that American bazookas destroyed or forced the abandonment of over 300 German armoured vehicles in the Falaise Pocket, 300 Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, representing perhaps 50 million Reichsmarks in equipment value, destroyed by weapons costing a few $1,000s. Klaus Becker did not fight in the Falaise Pocket. His company had been disbanded after the Villers-Bocage disaster. He was reassigned to a training unit in Germany, tasked with teaching new panzer commanders the lessons learned in Normandy. The first lesson: bazookas are not toys. The training manual Becker helped write in September 1944 acknowledged realities that earlier German doctrine had refused to accept. Panthers and Tigers were superior tanks when fighting other tanks at range. But in close terrain against infantry with anti-tank rockets, technical superiority meant nothing. The manual recommended specific tactics: never advance without infantry support to clear anti-tank teams, never enter close terrain without extensive reconnaissance, never assume infantry positions are harmless, maintain maximum possible standoff range, use high explosive and machine gun fire to suppress suspected bazooka positions before advancing. These were defensive tactics. Reactive tactics: everything that blitzkrieg doctrine had rejected. Speed and aggression had been replaced by caution and suppression. The predator had become prey. German attempts to counter the bazooka threat revealed the desperation of their strategic position. Some Panthers were fitted with additional armour skirts called Schürzen, designed to detonate shaped charges before they reached the main armor. These added weight and mechanical complexity. They were marginally effective against glancing hits but could not prevent penetration from direct impacts. Other Panthers received applique armor patches welded to vulnerable areas. Again, marginal improvement at best. The fundamental problem remained. American infantry possessed thousands of weapons that could kill Panthers, and there was no armor scheme that could make a Panther invulnerable at close range without making it too heavy to move. Production attempted to compensate. Germany accelerated Panzerschreck production. By late 1944, German infantry companies were finally receiving anti-tank rockets in numbers comparable to American distribution. But this came too late to matter strategically. The German army of late 1944 was not the army of 1940. Experienced infantry had been killed in Russia. Replacements were undertrained teenagers and overage reservists. These soldiers could be issued Panzerschrecks, but they lacked the training and battlefield experience to use them effectively under fire. American infantry, by contrast, had been training with bazookas since 1942. By 1944, American soldiers had muscle memory for bazooka operations. They could load, aim, and fire under stress. They worked as teams, with riflemen providing security while bazooka operators engaged targets. They understood combined arms tactics at squad level. This training differential created battlefield effectiveness gaps that technology could not bridge. German soldiers with technically superior Panzerschrecks were less effective than American soldiers with inferior bazookas because the Americans had better training, better unit cohesion, and better tactical doctrine. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's final attempt to achieve operational success through armoured offensive. Hitler committed strategic reserves, including elite SS Panzer divisions with new Panthers and King Tigers. The initial assault achieved surprise and gained ground through weak American positions, but within days the offensive stalled. Multiple factors contributed. Fuel shortages prevented exploitation. Weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to devastate German columns. American reinforcements arrived faster than German intelligence predicted. But a critical factor was the universal presence of bazookas in American infantry positions. At Bastogne, surrounded American infantry held against repeated panzer attacks. The town's streets and buildings provided perfect ambush positions. German tanks attempting to penetrate the perimeter were destroyed by bazookas at ranges under 50 meters. SS Panzer commanders reported that every approach to Bastogne was covered by anti-tank fire. At Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry repulsed waves of armoured attacks by the 1st SS Panzer Division. Again, bazookas proved decisive. German Panthers and King Tigers could not bring their superior guns and armour to bear in close terrain where American infantry controlled the engagement ranges. At St. Vith, American engineers and infantry destroyed multiple German tanks during the initial breakthrough, buying critical time for defensive positions to be organized. Bazooka teams operated independently, ambushing German columns, then withdrawing before German infantry could respond. The Bulge offensive collapsed by late January 1945. Germany's last armoured reserves were destroyed. With them went any hope of reversing the war's outcome. Bazookas had not defeated Germany, but bazookas had negated Germany's most effective tactical weapon system. Without effective armour breakthrough capability, Germany could only conduct defensive operations. And defensive operations against enemies with overwhelming industrial superiority could only delay defeat, not prevent it. Klaus Becker surrendered to American forces near Leipzig in April 1945. He was interrogated by U.S. Army intelligence officers interested in German assessments of American equipment. The interrogation transcripts survive in National Archives records. When asked about the most effective American weapon system, Becker did not mention Sherman tanks or P-47 fighter bombers or long-tom artillery. He mentioned the bazooka. The interrogation officer seemed surprised and asked for clarification. Becker's response was recorded verbatim. The rocket launcher changed how infantry fought tanks. Before 1943, infantry avoided tanks. After 1943, infantry hunted tanks. This destroyed German armor doctrine. We could not operate independently. We could not achieve breakthrough. We could not exploit success. Every advance required infantry support we did not have. Every attack into close terrain meant losses we could not replace. The weapon was simple, but it was everywhere. That was what mattered. Other German officers provided similar assessments during post-war interrogations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated that proliferation of infantry anti-tank weapons fundamentally altered the operational environment for armor. Tactics that succeeded in 1940 and 1941 failed in 1944 because infantry had become lethal to tanks. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German Panzer doctrine, acknowledged in post-war writings that independent armor operations became impossible once enemy infantry possessed effective anti-tank weapons. The speed and shock that characterized blitzkrieg required armor to operate ahead of supporting infantry. When that became suicidal, blitzkrieg died. Production statistics tell the quantitative story behind these qualitative assessments. American bazooka production reached 476,628 units by war's end. Total rocket production exceeded 15 million rounds. Unit costs remained remarkably stable throughout the war. $19 to $25 per launcher. $8.85 per rocket in 1945 dollars. Compare this to German tank production. Total Panther production from January 1943 through April 1945. Approximately 6,000 tanks. Cost per Panther, 117,000 Reichsmarks, roughly 47,000 American dollars at official exchange rates. The mathematics were brutal. For the cost of one Panther, America could produce approximately 2,000 bazookas or 5,000 rockets. Even accounting for the fact that bazookas were less effective than tanks in open combat, the numerical disparity was overwhelming. Combat effectiveness data from European Theatre of Operations reports provide statistical validation of battlefield experiences. American forces reported that bazookas accounted for approximately 12% of German tank losses. This figure seems modest, until you consider that anti-tank guns accounted for 31% and other tanks accounted for 38%. Bazookas were infantry weapons, carried by ordinary soldiers, not specialized units. They were not designed to be primary tank destroyers. They were designed to give infantry the capability to defend themselves against armor. That they accounted for 12% of German tank losses, while being secondary weapons operated by non-specialists, demonstrates their revolutionary impact. More importantly, bazookas forced German armor to operate cautiously, which reduced German offensive capability. Statistics cannot measure this effect, but German after-action reports consistently noted that American infantry positions had to be treated as serious threats, even when no tanks or anti-tank guns were present. German tactical reports from late 1944 included standardized warnings about American bazooka employment. Infantry companies were instructed to expect bazookas at squad level. Armored units were instructed to suppress suspected infantry positions before closing to assault range. These instructions represented fundamental changes to doctrine that had governed German operations since 1939. The bazooka's influence extended beyond World War II. Every modern military equips infantry with man-portable anti-tank weapons. The concept, proven by the bazooka, that individual soldiers must possess organic capability to engage armored vehicles, became foundational to post-war military organization worldwide. Soviet forces developed the RPG series of rocket-propelled grenades, direct descendants of the bazooka concept. The RPG-7, introduced in 1961, became the most widely distributed anti-tank weapon in history, over 9 million units produced. Present in every conflict from Vietnam through Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine. Western militaries developed successive generations of anti-tank weapons. The American M72 LAW, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, the British LAW-80, the American Javelin with fire and forget guidance. Each generation improved performance, but all retained the fundamental bazooka concept. Infantry portable, simple enough for basic training, effective enough to threaten armored vehicles. Modern main battle tanks carry reactive armor, cage armor, active protection systems, all designed to defeat shaped charge weapons descended from Mohaupt's original design and the bazooka's application of that design. Tanks costing $8 million carry defensive systems specifically designed to counter weapons costing a few $1,000s. This is the lasting legacy of the bazooka. Not that it was the perfect weapon. It was not. German Panzerschrecks had better penetration. Later, American designs had better range and accuracy. But the bazooka was good enough, cheap enough, and simple enough to give to every infantry squad. That combination changed warfare permanently. The mythology of the invincible tank died, in hedgerows outside Villers-Bocage. It died on roads through the Falaise pocket. It died in streets at Bastogne, killed by weapons so simple that German intelligence initially dismissed them as barely worth mentioning in technical assessments. Klaus Becker survived the war and returned to civilian life in West Germany. He worked as an engineer for a manufacturing firm, applying his technical knowledge to peacetime industry. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. When asked, he would acknowledge he had commanded tanks, but provided few details. In 1983, a military historian conducting research on Panzer Division tracked Becker down and requested an interview. Becker was 71 years old. He agreed to speak on the condition that the interview focus on technical and tactical matters, not personal experiences or politics. The interview transcript includes a revealing exchange near the end. The historian asked what single factor had most surprised Becker during his combat service. Becker thought for a long moment before responding. "We believed our tanks were the best in the world. This was not propaganda, it was technical fact. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. The Sherman could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any range. Therefore, we should have dominated tank combat. But wars are not fought on paper. The Americans gave their infantry weapons that cost nothing and could kill our tanks that cost everything. They did not try to match our tanks. They made our tanks irrelevant. That was brilliant. We never understood it until too late." The historian asked if Becker believed the bazooka changed the war's outcome. Becker's response was carefully measured. "Germany lost the war because we fought enemies with greater industrial capacity, larger populations, and more resources. No weapon could have changed that. But the bazooka changed how we lost. It made our strongest tactical weapon system vulnerable to their weakest soldiers. It forced us to fight defensively when our doctrine required offensive action. It destroyed our confidence. Could we have won with better tactics, better doctrine, better responses to the bazooka threat? No. But we might have prolonged the war, caused more casualties, achieved better negotiating position. The bazooka ensured our defeat would be rapid and complete." Klaus Becker died in 1991 at age 79. His obituary mentioned his wartime service briefly, noting he had commanded tanks in France and Germany. There was no mention of Villers-Bocage or the 14 Panthers destroyed in one afternoon. But the lesson of Villers-Bocage survives in every military around the world that equips its infantry with anti-tank weapons. Technical superiority alone does not guarantee victory. Adequate weapons, properly distributed and employed, can defeat superior weapons operated by smaller numbers of specialists. Democracy proved more effective than tyranny, not because democratic soldiers were braver or more skilled, but because democratic industrial systems produced enough adequate weapons to overwhelm smaller numbers of superior weapons. Mathematics defeated mythology, mass production defeated masterful engineering, and a $33 rocket killed a $47,000 tank, often enough to change how wars were fought. The Germans thought bazookas were toys, until those toys destroyed 14 Panthers in one afternoon at Villers-Bocage. By the time German doctrine adapted, American factories had produced 500,000 bazookas. The adaptation came too late. The war was already lost. Edgar Brandt's mortar gave infantry their own artillery. Henry Mohaupt's shaped charge gave infantry the ability to kill tanks. Leslie Skinner and Edward Oole's launcher combined these concepts into a weapon simple enough for mass production and mass distribution. Together, these innovations ended the era when tanks could operate with near impunity against infantry. But the invincible tank, the breakthrough weapon that could shatter defensive lines through shock and speed alone, that tank died in Normandy, killed by steel tubes, flashlight batteries, and shaped charges that any factory worker could assemble during a lunch break. Klaus Becker understood this on June 13, 1944, watching his Panthers burn from rockets fired by infantry he could not see from positions he could not suppress. He understood that everything German armor doctrine assumed about battlefield dominance had just been invalidated by a weapon the Americans stamped out in Detroit between breakfast and dinner. The mathematics were always going to favor America's industrial capacity over Germany's engineering perfection. The bazooka just made those mathematics visible in the most brutal way possible. One afternoon, 14 Panthers, $33 rockets, democracy had weaponized adequacy, and adequacy, produced in overwhelming quantity, proved more than sufficient to destroy perfection. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.